Okay, so let's introduce our next author, Dame Agatha Mary Clarissa Christie, who writes our next story, The Murder on the Orient Express. So, Christie wrote 75 novels, 66 detective novels, 14 short stories. She's perhaps the world's most famous mystery writer and one of the best-selling novelists of all time. Her works are reportedly outsold only by Shakespeare and the Bible. She has kind of her own mystery in her own personal life. And in 1926, Agatha Christie disappears for 11 days. The famed murder mystery writer was in the midst of a divorce from her first husband, Archie Christie, and she was dealing with the aftermath of the death of her mother. December 3rd, she left her home, and the next morning her car was found abandoned nearby. She eventually returns, doesn't say much, can't really remember where she was. It's never quite been figured out. So, mystery writer has her own mystery. She creates a detective character, Hercule Poirot, and he is from Belgium, the country of Belgium. And he was a police commissioner who turns detective. So Poirot is one of Christie's most famous long-running characters. He appears in 33 of her detective novels, a couple of plays. She also wrote a couple of plays, and about 50 of the short stories that were published between 1920 and 1975. So we have Poe, we have Doyle. Now, Christie is our most contemporary author of the three. And the language in her text is very much modern, much easier read than both Poe and Doyle. Very much contemporary in her writing style. Poe has some description. Doyle goes into great length of description. Christie goes even further from a more feminine approach. And we'll see the differences as we read on. So her main character, Hercule Poirot, has been portrayed on radio, film, television by various actors. Poirot's name was derived from two other fictional detectives of the time. A detective named Hercule Poirot and Frank Howell Evans' Monsieur Poirot, who was a real retired Belgian police officer who was living in London. The more obvious influence on early Poirot stories is that of Arthur Conan Doyle. In Christie's autobiography states, "I was still writing in the Sherlock Holmes tradition, eccentric detective, stooge assistant, with a Lestrade-type Scotland Yard detective, Inspector Zapp." For his part, Conan Doyle acknowledged basing his detective stories on the model of Edgar Allan Poe's C. Augustin Dupin and his anonymous narrator, and based his Sherlock Holmes on Joseph Bell, who, in the use of logic, prefigured Poirot's reliance on his little gray cells. And we hear Poirot speaking about his little gray cells, just as a reference back to both Sherlock Holmes and Dupin's logic and deduction. Poirot first appeared in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, published in 1920, and exited in Curtain, published in 1975. So we've got about 50 years worth of Hercule Poirot. Following the latter, Poirot is the only fictional character to receive an obituary on the front page of the New York Times. By 1930, Agatha Christie found Poirot insufferable, and by 1960, she felt that he was a detestable, bombastic, tiresome, egocentric little creep. Yet the public loved him, and Christie refused to kill him off, claiming that it was her duty to produce what the public liked. So here again, two authors want to kill off their main character. They're tired of writing about the subject, but the public says, no, we want more. Captain Arthur Hastings' first description of Poirot. He says he was hardly more than 5 feet 4 inches, but carried himself with great dignity. His head was exactly the shape of an egg, and he always perched it a little on one side. His mustache was very stiff and military. Even if everything on his face was covered up, the tips of his mustache and his little pink-tipped nose would be visible. The neatness of his attire was almost incredible. I believe a speck of dust would have caused him more pain than a bullet wound. Yet this quaint, dignified little man, who I was sorry to see now limped badly, had been in his time one of the most celebrated members of the Belgian police. Poirot is extremely punctual. He carries a pocket watch almost to the end of his career. He was also particular about his personal finances, preferring to keep a bank balance of £444, 4 shillings, and 4 pence. One of the more famous actors who played Poirot, David Chaussee, who played Poirot on television, said, "There is no question he's obsessive-compulsive. He enjoyed finding the sort of obsessive compulsiveness in Poirot. He mentioned in Curtain and the Clocks, he was fond of classical music, particularly Mozart and Bach. Poirot's investigative techniques assist him in solving cases. For in the long run, either through a lie or through truth, people were bound to give themselves away. At the end, Poirot usually reveals his description of the sequence of events and his deductions to a room of suspects, often leading to the culprit's apprehension. Between the world wars, Poirot traveled all over Europe, Africa, Asia, and half of South America, investing crimes and solving murders. So that's a little bit about Agatha Christie and her writing of her main character, Hercule Poirot. Now, she comes up with the idea for him because during World War I, there were a lot of refugees from Belgium who had escaped Europe and gone to Europe. And in her little town, there were several, I guess you'd call it like a refugee camp for these Belgians. And it was encouraged by the English to become friendly with them, which she did in her home little town. And this is how she comes up with the idea of a Belgian detective. So that's a little bit about Agatha Christie, and we will move on to the next slide, which kind of sets the background in our story, The Orient Express, although under a different name called the Daisy Armstrong murders. It's a direct reference to a real crime, kidnapping of a young child, 20 months old, of the famous aviator, Charles Lindbergh. True story, happened in New Jersey. Again, just like Poe, relating back to a real-life crime in New York City of Marie Rogers. Again, going back to Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, his true historic events of the Mormon exodus from Illinois to Salt Lake City, intertwining these real-life events into a fiction story. Okay, so we'll move on to our next slide from here. The Lindbergh kidnapping. Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., 20-month-old son of the famous aviator, and Anne Morrow Lindbergh, was kidnapped about 9 p.m. on March 1st, 1932, from the nursery on the second floor of the Lindbergh home near Hopewell, New Jersey. The child's absence was discovered and reported to his parents, who were then at home, at approximately 10 p.m. by the child's nurse, Betty Gow. A search of the premises was immediately made, and a ransom note demanding $50,000 was found on the nursery windowsill. After the Hopewell police were notified, the report was telephoned to the New Jersey State Police, who assumed charge of the investigation. son of Charles Lindbergh. During the search at the kidnapping scene, traces of mud were found on the floor of the nursery. Footprints, impossible to measure, were found under the nursery window. 2 sections of the ladder had been used in reaching the window. One of the 2 sections was split or broken where it joined the other, indicating that the ladder had broken during the ascent or descent. There were no bloodstains in or about the nursery, nor were there any fingerprints. Household and estate employees were questioned and investigated. Colonel Lindbergh asked friends to communicate with the kidnappers, and they made widespread appeals to the kidnappers to start negotiations. Various underworld characters were dealt with in attempts to contact the kidnappers, and numerous clues were advanced and exhausted. After several months, ransom notes were exchanged. After some investigating, an arrest was made, and he was found to be Bruno Richard Hauptmann, the individual to whom the automobile license had been issued, a German carpenter who had been in the country for approximately 11 years. A $20 gold ransom certificate was found on his person. His description fit perfectly of that of John as described by Dr. Condon, who was the contact between Lindbergh and the kidnappers. And in his house was found a pair of shoes, which had been purchased with a $20 ransom bill recovered on September 8, 1934. Hauptmann admitted several other purchases which had been made with ransom certificates. On the night of September 19, 1934, he was positively identified by Joseph Poirot as the individual from whom he had received the 5th ransom note to be delivered to Dr. Condon. The following day, ransom certificates in excess of $13,000 were found secreted away in the garage of Hauptmann's residence. Shortly thereafter, he was identified by Dr. Condon as John, to whom the ransom had been paid. It was also ascertained that he was in possession of a Dodge sedan automobile, which answered the description of that seen in the vicinity of the Lindbergh home the day prior to the kidnapping. The trial of Hauptmann began on January 3, 1935, in Flemington, New Jersey, and lasted 5 weeks. The case against him was based on circumstantial evidence. Tool marks on the ladder matched the tools owned by Hauptmann. Wood in the ladder was found to match wood used as flooring in his attic. Dr. Condon's telephone number and address were found scrawled on a door frame inside a closet. Handwriting on the ransom notes matched samples of Hauptmann's handwriting. On February 13, 1935, the jury returned a verdict. Hauptmann was guilty of murder in the 1st degree. The sentence, death. On April 3, 1936, at 8:47 p.m., Richard Hauptmann was electrocuted. Let's take a look at a video about the Lindbergh kidnapping and murder. Okay, so let's get a very brief beginning start to our next story called The Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. So our hero, Hercule Poirot, starts off in Syria. And he has just solved a military crime, which would have been an embarrassment to France and to the military. We don't get a lot of details about that particular crime or situation which he helps to resolve. But nevertheless, that has concluded, and he is now leaving Syria and is going to Istanbul to spend a few days relaxing and then head back to London via the Orient Express. So he gets to the station or port, and he's on his way to the hotel. And he notices a British couple having a discussion. And he overhears the woman say something like, "Not now, we must wait until all this business is done." Okay, whatever. Kind of foreshadowing, but we have no details to go on at this point. So he arrives at the hotel, and he's booking his room, and there is a message for him that he must immediately go back to London. There is a train leaving that night, but it seems to be full, which is kind of odd. It's never really full, and this is not the main tourist season. In the hotel, he meets an old friend, Monsieur Bach, a fellow Belgian, and who just happens to be the director of the train company. So they're sitting there chatting away. Poirot observes two American men in the restaurant, one older and one younger. The older man is bald, and Poirot thinks he might be a philanthropist. But when the man looks over and makes eye contact with Poirot, he sees small and crafty eyes. He feels a strange malevolence coming from this person across the way. The old man tells the younger to pay a bill. His voice is kind of, he says, queer, soft, and dangerous voice. The young man agrees and calls the older man Mr. Ratchett. So Monsieur Bach escorts Poirot to the Orient Express train, and when they get to the train, they find out that it's entirely full, which is very odd for this time of year. Even the secret compartment that's always saved and reserved has been taken. So he was able to find a room with a man who hasn't yet come to the train yet, Mr. Harris. And it's a second class berth. But it's a shared berth, and he's sharing it with a man named Hector McQueen, who was the younger American from the hotel restaurant talking to Ratchett. The next day, Poirot joins Bach, and they are sitting together, eavesdropping, making comments about the 13 passengers in the dining car, guessing, jobs, nationalities, that sort of thing, relationships, whatever. So the nationalities of the passengers are quite extensive. There are Americans, English, Hungarian, German, Italian. Later we find out Russian. So we have quite a cast of characters here. Ratchett approaches Poirot and sits down. He identifies Poirot from newspapers and so forth. Poirot is kind of a famous guy. And he offers Poirot a job promising big money. He says that he has received threats on his life, and he wants Poirot to ensure his safety. They have kind of a verbal interchange. Poirot says, "What? Only one threat on your life?" Men that have one threat on their life usually have many threats on their lives. So, nevertheless, Ratchett makes the deal, raises the amount of money. Poirot's not interested. Ratchett wants him to say straight out, "Why are you refusing to work for me?" And Poirot responds, "I don't like your face," and he leaves. So it doesn't look like Ratchett's going to get any help from Poirot. So the train pulls into Belgrade, and Poirot gets his own cabin, and Bach moves to an adjacent train car that's only occupied by a Greek doctor. As the night approaches, Poirot and Bach both notice that barriers are breaking down and passengers are becoming more comfortable with each other, which is usual on any long journey trip like that. Yeah, you come in on your own, but very soon you start talking with the other people that you're sharing this experience with. So nothing out of the ordinary here. He overhears the colonel, but not talking at length to Hector McQueen about politics. Mrs. Hubbard takes under her wing the Swedish woman, offering her aspirin for her headache. Mrs. Hubbard is quite a talker. If you do the movie scene or the audiobook, she is quite the talker about her daughter, mostly. My daughter says this, my daughter thinks that. Yeah. Okay, Mrs. Hubbard kind of gossips with Poirot about Ratchett, noting that she says she wouldn't be surprised if that man turned out to be a murderer. And she's concerned because her compartment is right next to Ratchett's. Poirot just kind of listening to it all, and he retires to his new cabin, which is on the other side of Ratchett's cabin. So Poirot falls asleep. He's awoken later when he hears a loud groan, and he notices that the train has stopped. He looks out his cabin doorway down the hallway, and he sees the conductor, Pierre Michel, checking on Ratchett. And a voice responds in French that everything is okay. So the conductor's knocking on Ratchett's door, everything okay, in French. And a voice replies in French, yeah, everything's okay. I'm just having a nightmare. Now this is odd because Ratchett doesn't speak anything but English. So we've got our first little clue here, what might be going on. Nevertheless, Poirot can't fall back to sleep. He rings the bell for the conductor. He hears a nearby bell ringing a few times. The conductor goes to that first bell, and Poirot overhears a conversation between the conductor and Mrs. Hubbard, mostly Mrs. Hubbard talking. When the conductor does arrive, the conductor explains to Poirot that Mrs. Hubbard believes she saw a man in her cabin, and the conductor couldn't really calm her down, and that the train has been stalled between stations in Yugoslavia. Poirot is just about ready to fall back to sleep, and he hears a thud noise next door. He goes out, looks out the doorway into the hallway, and he sees a woman wearing a scarlet kimono walking by with her back to him, with a couple of dragons on the back of the kimono. The next morning, there's a big commotion because the train is stopped indefinitely in a blizzard. The train manager, Poirot's friend, Mr. Bach, calls on Poirot and tells him that Mr. Ratchett was stabbed to death last night. They call the doctor, the Greek doctor, Dr. Constantine, and the three of them go into Ratchett's room, and they estimate that the murder takes place between 12 and 2 in the morning. The revelation that the murder occurred sometime late the previous night and early that morning throws the details to Poirot, and he's got something to work with, but we'll get into a little bit more detail about that later. Further details of the murder follow. Ratchett was discovered by the conductor at 11 that morning, but his door was locked and bolted. A window was open onto the snow, but it seems impossible for anyone to have entered or exited because the snow was so deep. But maybe. It looked like initially Ratchett was stabbed about 12 to 15 times with apparent savagery. Well, that changes a little bit when we take a closer look. Mr. Bach employs Poirot to take the case. This is an embarrassment for their line, the Orient Express, which is famous around the world. Poirot agrees. He's kind of bored, so why not? It's initially concluded that no one could have exited the murder scene since the train was stopped in the snow, but who knows? But if that's the case, then that means the murderer could still be on the train. So Poirot is kind of introducing himself as a detective, which he is. Eventually, he collects all the guests' passports, and he'll start eventually to interview each of the guests. He runs into McQueen and tells him the news that Ratchett has been murdered. And McQueen doesn't seem to be surprised. In fact, he says, so they got him after all. And McQueen explains his history with Ratchett, relating the story of how he joined Ratchett as a personal secretary, since Ratchett was hampered by knowing no languages. Okay. If Ratchett doesn't know any languages, why is he speaking French to the conductor? Interesting. So McQueen tells Poirot that Ratchett has received several threatening letters written in an over-the-top style. It says, quote, "We're going to get you, see?" The most recent letter was just a few days ago. Poirot looks at the letter and he thinks it was written by multiple people, but he doesn't seem impressed otherwise. After some probing, McQueen reveals he knows little of Ratchett's life and history, but he can't pretend to have any affection for him. As these interviews continue a little later, it's kind of funny at the end of each interview that Poirot and Bach discuss the guilt of each person. And Bach pretty much thinks that every one of them is guilty, but we'll get into that a little later. So again, they're kind of back looking more closely at Ratchett's body in his cabin. And Dr. Constantine concludes that Ratchett was stabbed exactly 12 times. But some of the blows are glancing, while others were very deep. They discover that some were delivered by the left hand and some by the right hand. So what's going on here? This means there could have been two people involved in the murder. But we're just speculating at this point. Poirot searches the cabin. He finds a loaded gun under Ratchett's pillow. He finds a mixture of sleeping medication nearby. He finds a handkerchief with the initial H on it. And he finds a pipe cleaner and a watch stopped at exactly 12:45. He also finds a scrap of burnt paper, which reveals the name Daisy Armstrong. This starts to lead us a little deeper into the case, maybe providing a motivation. So he's dining with Monsieur Bach and Dr. Constantine. Poirot announces that he's discovered that Mr. Ratchett's real name is Cassetti, the man responsible for the murder of Daisy Armstrong. Again, as we talked about earlier, Daisy Armstrong is just a replacement for the Lindbergh baby kidnapping and murder, which really took place in New Jersey in America at about the same time. So Cassetti was the man who did it, and he escaped justice on a technical inaccuracy. So Poirot concludes that the murdered Mr. Ratchett was actually this Cassetti from America, having fled to Europe and changed his name. Starting to notify all the different passengers that Ratchett has met an untimely demise. And Poirot informs Hector McQueen that his late boss was actually the criminal Cassetti, getting back to our Daisy Armstrong / Lindbergh murder kidnapping. And McQueen reacts with surprise and anger, saying, "That damned skunk." Doesn't sound pretty harsh, but anyway. McQueen reveals a personal connection to the Armstrong case. His father was the district attorney who unsuccessfully prosecuted Cassetti. He even says that he'd have been willing to kill Ratchett himself had he known, but he admits, quote, "Seems I'm kind of incriminating myself." Yes, you would be. McQueen had left the train at one of the stops, but can't remember if he barred the door to the platform on his way back in. Next, Poirot calls Mr. Ratchett's personal valet, Edward Masterman, the sober-minded and proper British man with an inexpressive face. He answers questions about his age and background in clipped phrases with little elaboration. Masterman reports that he had last seen Ratchett at 9 the previous night, and that Ratchett had been upset over a letter he was reading, which was, in fact, another death threat. Ratchett routinely took sleeping medication, which Masterman would give him, as he did the previous night. Finally, Poirot asks Masterman if he is a pipe smoker, but he responds that he only smokes cigarettes. He then, Poirot then, next interview is with Mrs. Hubbard. We've talked about her a little bit. The older American woman who immediately demands to see the person in authority. Mrs. Hubbard claims that the murderer was in her room last night. She says she woke to the presence of a shadowy figure and pretended to be asleep, worrying about, quote, "these nasty trains and all the outrages I've read of." Soon she gathered the courage to ring the conductor's bell. After Pierre Michel turned on the lights, they found no one there. Mrs. Hubbard quickly grows impatient with the investigator's skepticism, but she offers a piece of evidence, a button from a train conductor's uniform, which she found near her bed. and is gratified when Poirot accepts it, saying, quote, "That, madam, I call evidence." The plot thickens. Poirot then tells Mrs. Hubbard about Ratchett's connection to the Armstrong case. And while she admits she's familiar with it, calling Cassetti a monster, she doesn't have a personal connection. He follows up on the scarlet kimono, but she denies owning one. Mrs. Hubbard rises to leave, and Poirot suggests she forgot her handkerchief, holding the one with an H found in Ratchett's cabin, but she says it isn't hers. She uses less expensive, more practical handkerchiefs. Poirot then questions Greta Olson whether she's been to America, which she denies. She praises Americans for their financial investment in schools and hospitals. When informed that Ratchett was the man who killed Daisy Armstrong, Greta becomes emotional and leaves crying. After Greta Olson's departure, Mr. Bach asked Poirot to call the Italian man who roomed with Masterman, the valet. Mr. Bach is fixated on the Italian because, as he says, an Italian's weapon is the knife. Before moving on to the next witness, Poirot and Mr. Bach ask Pierre Michel about the button that Mrs. Hubbard found. Pierre flies into a panic when the implication becomes clear to him, but insists that he has not lost the button and finds conductors from the adjacent train cars to vouch for him. Pierre Michel insists that he saw no one else in the hall on his way to Mrs. Hubbard's. This prompts speculation about whether a suspect could have slipped out of Mrs. Hubbard's room between her ringing of the bell and Pierre Michel's arrival. Next is the Princess Dragamov. Although Russian by origin, she now resides in Paris and is on her way home after staying at the Austrian embassy. For much of the previous night, she claims that she was in her cabin with her German maid, Hildegard Schmidt, who massaged her to relieve her arthritis. It emerges that the princess personally knew the Armstrongs through Sonia's mother, Linda Arden. As a result, she finds it entirely just that Ratchett, the man who ruined them, is dead. Poirot also asks the color of her dressing gown, which is black satin. Then the princess leaves, but not before repeating Hercule Poirot's name and declaring, quote, "It's destiny," a remark that puzzles Poirot. The Hungarian nobles, Count and Countess Andrani, are next, but only the Count appears. Poirot insists on her presence anyway. He receives her passport, which reads Elena Maria Andrani, maiden name Goldenberg, and has a spot of grease on it. But the Count and Countess have diplomatic status, which means they don't have to answer questions to anyone about anything. Poirot asks her to sign her name after answering a few questions about her marriage to the Count. He interjects, "By the way, does your husband smoke?" to which the Countess responds that he smokes cigarettes and cigars, but not a pipe. The Countess becomes suspicious when Poirot asks about her dressing gown, but reveals that hers is a corn-colored chiffon. She asks whether he's a Yugoslavian detective, to which Poirot replies, "I'm an international detective, and I belong to the world." He then pivots to English to ask if she speaks that language, and she responds that she speaks a little in a heavy accent. Colonel Arbuthnot is the next witness to be called. Poirot finds his French lacking, so he switches to English to speak to him. Gathering basic details, Poirot finds him uncooperative, so he becomes more foreign than he need have been to draw him out. Poirot likes to play games with people for sure. Poirot leans on his connection to Mary Debenham, which the colonel finds highly irregular. Poirot tells a white lie that the murderer was most likely committed by a woman, and so he must be especially scrutinizing to all the women on the train. He notes that it's a challenge to deal with the English as they are very reserved. Again, with the stereotypical comments. Poirot further implies that the colonel feels warmly in the matter of Mary Debenham, to which the colonel reacts with hostility. Then Poirot asks him to cast his mind back, setting the scene by saying, "You smoke perhaps a cigarette, perhaps a pipe?" And Arbuthnot volunteers that he smokes a pipe. When informed that Ratchett was the man who kidnapped Daisy Armstrong, Colonel Arbuthnot approves of his death, but he would have preferred that it had happened lawfully. He adds, a trial by jury is a sound system. Back to our number 12. After his departure, Poirot sums up the interview, finding it hard to believe that an honorable, slightly stupid Englishman would stab Ratchett 12 times. He insists that one must respect the psychology. The investigators move on to the last of the first-class passengers with the American Mr. Hardman. Mr. Hardman confirms that he's a traveling typewriter ribbon salesman. But on learning Hercule Poirot's identity, he says that he better, quote, come clean. He says his true occupation is a private investigator from a respected American detective agency. Hardman volunteers that he knew McQuinn by sight, having had dealings with his father, the district attorney. Next is Antonio Foscarelli. Antonio is not a man who had to have information dragged from him, and he volunteers that he has spent many years in America as a salesman. Antonio largely confirms the story of his roommate, the valet, Mr. Masterman. Mary Debenham is next, and Poirot finds her uncooperative, giving non-committal responses to each question or claiming ignorance. Unlike some other passengers, she merely shrugs when she hears the nature of Ratchett's murder and notes that, quote, people die every day. Poirot responds that, quote, you are very Anglo-Saxon. Mrs. Debenham recites her recent history as a governess in Baghdad. He also asks her whether she owns a scarlet kimono, and she responds, no, that is not mine. She reveals she did see someone in a scarlet kimono when she woke this morning at 5, but did not recognize the person. Before she leaves, Mrs. Debenham says that her roommate, the Swedish woman Greta Olsen, is worried that she's a suspect for the murder, as she was the last to see Ratchett alive. Poirot confirms Greta's alibi and tells Miss Debenham that Greta is not a primary suspect. Poirot is confused by the interview with Miss Debenham. He tells Mr. Bach that he believes this was a premeditated crime rather than a crime of passion. Next is Hildegard Schmidt. Hildegard maintains that she doesn't know anything. She says she was called to attend to the princess the previous night. When she notes that she doesn't like to wear a dressing gown in the presence of the princess, Poirot gently interrupts to compliment her scarlet dressing gown, again with the tricky questions. She replies that hers is dark blue. According to Hildegard, after massaging the princess, she returned to her cabin and slept. However, she did see a conductor coming out of one of the compartments and walked swiftly past her in the other direction. The conductor passed her moving towards the dining car, ignoring a ringing bell. Interesting. Asked to describe the man, Hildegard remembers a small, dark man who said, "Pardon me," in a feminine voice. Poirot asks whether the handkerchief found in Ratchett's room is hers. Hildegard responds, no. Poirot, Mr. Bach, and Dr. Constantine take stock of the evidence. They're faced with a small, dark man, a prime suspect who seems to have vanished as he can't be hiding on the train. Seemingly, they're confronted with a missing scarlet kimono and a missing conductor's uniform, one lacking the button that Mrs. Hubbard found in her cabin. To that end, Poirot resolves to search each passenger's luggage. He makes a grandiose prediction that the kimono will be found in one of the male passengers' luggage and the conductor's uniform in Hildegard Schmidt's luggage. As they are wrapping up, Mrs. Hubbard bursts in screaming about a bloody knife in her sponge bag and promptly faints. Poirot carries on with his search of the passenger's luggage while conducting short second interviews with them. Next up is Colonel Arbuthnot. In the search, Poirot finds pipe cleaners that match exactly the one found in Ratchett's cabin. Arbuthnot seems untroubled by the focus on the pipe cleaners and notes that he always uses them if he can get them. Poirot searches Hildegard Schmidt's luggage there, true to his prediction, he finds a conductor's uniform with one button missing. Hildegard panics and insists that the uniform isn't hers, and Poirot reassures her strangely by saying he's as convinced of her innocence as he is that she's a good cook. This comes into fact later. Poirot notes that the mystery of the scarlet kimono remains a mystery that's difficult because it's been made difficult. Returning to his own bags, Poirot finds in them the scarlet kimono, which he sees as defiance. Yep, I would say you're pretty accurate with that one. Poirot, Mr. Bach, and Dr. Constantine reconvene. Mr. Bach again stresses his confusion with the case and the opinion that none of the passengers' testimony has given any definite evidence, or at least he did not observe it. Poirot responds, quote, "That is because you did not listen." Then Poirot assembles a list of the identities of the passengers, complete with alibis and distinguishing information. Each is vouched for by at least one other passenger, and most have either no motive or no evidence against them. They are of various nationalities. Colonel Whodunit has the evidence of the pipe cleaner in Ratchett's room. The princess has a strong motive, as she was very close to the Armstrongs. To supplement the suspect list, Poirot makes a list of unresolved questions. He notes they haven't assigned ownership of the handkerchief. The scarlet kimono is still an open question, as every female passenger has denied ownership of it, and the precise time of the murder is also in question. Dr. Constantine then raises the issue of multiple murderers acting independently. He cites as evidence Ratchett's wounds, as some are deep and others are superficial, and some suggest a left-handed murderer and others a right-handed one. Poirot reveals that he had invited each witness to write their name precisely to determine whether they were right or left-handed. Only the princess did not participate. Poirot begins to explain the results of his contemplation. He targets a few suggestive details, beginning with the grease spot on Countess Andrani's passport. He connects this to the handkerchief monogrammed with an H. Ignoring the letter for a moment, the elegance and expense of the handkerchief point to two women in particular, the princess and the Countess Andrani. He notes the convenience of the grease spot near the first letter of her name, Elena, and reasons that the grease spot was deliberately placed. And in fact, Poirot deduces that the grease spot was placed to obscure an H after the handkerchief was found. He concludes that Princess Andrani's true first name is not Elena, but Helena. Poirot brings a major constraint on any planned attempt to murder Ratchett, the blizzard. He reasons that the culprit had plan to depict the murder as an outside job committed by someone who had boarded and left the train at the next station. The existence of the extra conductor's uniform supports this. And Poirot says that if not for the snow, the uniform would be found in the toilet. But since the train was stalled, the culprit or culprits would be shown to be still on the train, complicating the plan. Poirot further recalls that Linda Arden, Sonia's mother, was a stage name, and that her actual surname was Goldenberg. Linda also had another daughter much younger than Sonia. He concludes from this that Countess Elena Andrani is actually Helena Goldenberg, Sonia Armstrong's younger sister. As a result, Princess, who knew the Armstrong family well, must have known Helena was on the train and lied that she had married an Englishman and moved to England. Poirot and Mr. Bach go to the dining car to confront the Count and Countess with this new information. Poirot first offers her the monogrammed handkerchief, which the Countess denies ownership of. But Poirot insists that the monogram matches the first letter of her name, Helena Goldenberg. Against Poirot's evidence, the Countess gives in, and her voice becomes, quote, for the first time, a definitely American voice. The Countess gives an impassioned excuse that Ratchett had destroyed the three people, quote, I loved best and who made up my home, my world. In that moment, she appears a true daughter of the world-famous actress Linda Arden. She explains that she lied because her motive to kill Ratchett was so strong, yet she swears she did not commit the crime. The Count admits his complicity in the deception, saying that the alteration of the passport and luggage was his doing. He offers an excuse that he wanted to protect his wife from false suspicion and media scandal, and that the alteration of the passport was easily done. Poirot gives him back a backhanded phrase. He says, you have the makings of a very fine criminal and an apparently remorseless determination to mislead justice. Alone again, Mr. Bach expresses certainty to Poirot that the Countess is guilty, but Poirot reminds him that there was another opinion for the ownership of the handkerchief. Indeed, the princess enters the dining car to claim ownership of it. Mr. Bach is shocked, objecting that her first name is Natalia, to which the princess responds that the letter N appears as an H in the Russian alphabet. Poirot notes that the princess didn't say the handkerchief was hers, but the princess only answers, you did not ask me. She has no idea how her handkerchief ended up in Ratchett's room, but Poirot suspects she's lying. Poirot turns his attention to Colonel Arbuthnot. He again confronts Arbuthnot with the pipe cleaner, but Arbuthnot is unimpressed and continues to stonewall him. Poirot asks about the ominous conversation with Miss Debenham in Syria. Arbuthnot refuses to answer. Finding little cooperation, Poirot ventures that Miss Debenham was Countess Andrani's governess at the time of the Daisy Armstrong kidnapping, after there was a, quote, minute's dead silence. Poirot calls for Miss Debenham. Poirot confronts her with the information that she lived with the Armstrongs at the time of Daisy's murder. Mary flinches before recovering and admitting the lie. Mary attributes the lie to the desire to escape scandal so that she could find further employment as a governess. When Poirot continues to press her, she's overwhelmed with emotion, and Arbuthnot yells at Poirot to leave her alone, threatening to, quote, break every bone in your damned body. They both leave, but not before Arbuthnot insists that Mary has nothing to do with this, quote, this business. Poirot calls still other passengers into the dining car. Anthony Foscarelli appears. He becomes hostile when Poirot begins questioning him, but relents after Poirot correctly guesses that he was the Armstrong chauffeur. Poirot summons Greta Olson, who immediately admits that she was Daisy's nurse. Masterman, the valet, enters. He admits straight away that he was Colonel Armstrong's assistant in the war and apologizes for his deceit. Mr. Bach and Dr. Constantine marvel at the carousel of emotional confessions and the coincidence of each passenger having a connection to the Armstrong household. Poirot states that he has known for some time who killed Mr. Ratchett, and he asks Mr. Bach to assemble the passengers in the dining car so that he can propose two solutions. So Poirot sets out the parameters of what they've discovered. Mr. Ratchett was stabbed between midnight and 2 in the morning, and that at 12:30 the train was stopped by a snowdrift. He further states that since no one boarded or left the train in that time, the murderer will be found among the assembled passengers. But then he says that, quote, was our theory, and Mr. Bach exclaims in surprise. Now, in Agatha Christie's stories, this seems to be her typical ending, either it be Poirot or Miss Marple, that all of the suspects somehow are all gathered together at the end, laying out the theories until the proper suspect is either pointed out or admits their guilt. So he sets out the alternative theory in which an unknown assailant was provided with a conductor's uniform, snuck on the train at one of the earlier stops, had a pass key. He entered Ratchett's cabin through Mrs. Hubbard's, stabbed him 12 times with the knife, abandoned the uniform and Hildegard's luggage, and left the train just before it departed. So this is the theory and the evidence that they are going to provide to the police. But we, as the reader, and Poirot, and Mr. Bach, and Dr. Constantine, and all of the passengers know very well what truly happened, that all the passengers are guilty. Okay, so that kind of wraps up our second part of the story, Murder on the Orient Express.